Mom, the 25th of July. Moscow, Sochi, and Adler were engulfed in hell. Unbelievable. The bridge was blown up. Torrents of smoke in the sky. Chaos on the ground. Russian air defense missed.
They hit it.
Drones attacked the Lukoil oil depot, railway stations, warehouses, and even the operational command center.
They hit it, yes, everything. Right here, in the Rosneft area.
Putin's residence is 2 kilometers away, the one from where he called Trump. The Russians are screaming in panic. Such smoke, Arkasha. It's scary. Yeah. God damn it. There it is. Damn, it's burning. Right next to your house. Sochi Airport is paralyzed. Hundreds of flights are delayed. Thousands of Russians are spending the night in Siberian airports, unable to reach the resorts. Crowds, panic, evacuation, screams. People are sleeping on the floor. 1,000 flights didn't depart or arrive. This is hysteria, agony. This is unreal. The vacationers are panicked. In the hotels, people are heading en masse to the underground parking lots. They're in shock, not used to this. And the locals into the bushes. Well, in Sochi, they're already ready to break away. In panic, they shout, "Why are they bombing Sochi? They owe Russia." Were you asleep? Why are they bombing Sochi? I don't understand. They owe Russia. Exactly. But isn't Sochi part of Russia? Damn it! Yeah. Sochi is no longer Russia. Russia is falling apart from the inside.
And today, there is widespread panic in Russia. Ukrainian strikes have swept from Moscow through the south, all the way to the Urals.
Too late to watch.
An airfield in Krasnodar Krai has been destroyed and power plants in Tambov and Kostroma are burning. Railway hubs are under attack, train stations in Moscow and other regions are on fire.
Damn, they hit the train station. Whoa, that was a hell of a blast. The railway blew up right by the bridge.
The energy and logistics sectors have been blown up. Meanwhile, the FSB is frantically inspecting tankers after Usluga. The Kremlin is afraid for its oil exports. For the first time, Putin admits that it's not the army, but the fuel flows that need to be protected first and foremost. What is this? Is this the start of a new phase of the war, or is it already a turning point? Moscow, the Moscow region and other regions are under heavy strikes from the Ukrainian armed forces. Russia is burning. We'll discuss all of this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Breaking news, friends. The Ukrainian armed forces struck several Russian military targets at once. Fires in Moscow. Muscovites are jumping out of windows.
A drone is flying. There it is. How close it is! Mom!
A military airfield in Armavir, where attack aircraft were based, has been destroyed. More than 20 explosions.
The bridge was blown up.
Explosions in Pyatigorsk, Grozny, Penza, Nevinomysk, even near Yekaterinburg. The Tambov and Kostroma power plants are on fire. Russia is losing control over its energy sector. Strikes have begun on railway junctions. This is very important. Key supply routes are collapsing. More than 200 train journeys have been delayed. Crowds, panic evacuation. Russians are simply complaining. And the FSB has already started mass inspections on tankers. The Kremlin is afraid of a repeat of the attacks in Ust-Luga. Putin is panicking. Now it's not the generals who are under protection, but the oil tankers. And of course, we've started striking oil refineries again. We'll discuss all this with the well-known military analyst, Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone good health.
Roman Grigorievich, how do you assess the situation, first of all, with the railways in Russia? Because we've started targeting railway hubs. This is being reported by Russians. There's panic, crowds. No one's happy. What do you think?
Well, railway hubs right now, especially the Rostov railway hub, are very important for us. We need to stop their logistics. The second wave of Russia's summer offensive is now moving up to the line of contact. Mainly, this concerns the Zaporizhia and Donetsk directions. Almost everything goes through the Rostov and Taganrog railway hubs. That's why strikes are being carried out on them, essentially. On various locations, meaning traction substations, power generation facilities, state district power plants, that is thermal power plants, depending on the possibilities. The main goal is to stop the movement of fuel, ammunition, equipment, and personnel to the theater of military operations in Ukraine. There are two key points here. One is the Kerch Bridge in Crimea, through which the Russians are currently moving about 30% of their military supplies. Mostly it goes through Crimea and then on to the Kherson and Zaporizhia directions. But part of the supplies for the Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk fronts, of course, comes from the Rostov side. So it's a good start. The main thing is not to stop. We absolutely need to make sure that we aren't stopped. We need to effectively disrupt all of these logistics, especially since the Russian army primarily moves by rail, which is a critical vulnerability for them.
So, Roman Grigorievich, I noticed that over the past few weeks, we've already carried out 4 strikes. So this is already becoming a daily routine tactic of the armed forces of Ukraine.
Well, I would like this to become systematic. Let me repeat. We've talked about this several times already. We've anticipated some correct actions, but then they stop. As soon as the destruction of Russian oil refineries begins, as soon as it gains a certain momentum, for some reason our office immediately stops it. As for why that happens, let the intelligence services figure it out. The same situation applies to the destruction of the Black Sea Fleet. As soon as the destruction of the Black Sea Fleet begins, the issue is immediately resolved, and that's it. No one touches it anymore. Right now, it's the same situation. I just hope this isn't an attempt to pressure the Russians over some process, then get something in return and stop it. In other words, the start is good, correct, and competent. The main thing is that this should be real systematic work to stop the entire logistics, the whole logistics chain, all the railway supply to the Russians. We have this capability. We have enough drones. The main thing is target designation. So right now, once again, this is just the beginning. The main thing is not to stop.
A strategic strike. The armed forces of Ukraine struck the Novokuybishevsk oil refinery. They hit it. Roman Grigorievich, the floor is yours.
That's exactly the point. It's not an oil refinery, but the information stream presented it as a refinery. It's what they call petrochemicals, oil synthesis, that also needs to be destroyed. But it's not a refinery. That is, certain types of products are synthesized there, mainly those that are also used by the Russian military for making explosives. But these are not oil refineries. Up to now, our office rats still don't allow us to destroy refineries. Not a single one of our long-range strike weapons has hit a refinery. But as for petrochemicals, of course, they need to be destroyed. Why? Because once again, I want to emphasize that the main components for producing explosives come from there.
Novocherkassk is on fire. Massive strikes. Drones attacked the power plant in Novocherkassk, Rostov region. The railway station was also hit. Large-scale explosions. The carpet plan was put into effect. Further reports say that drones attacked not only the railway infrastructure and the power plant, but also the Rostelecom building in the Rostov region. Roman Grigorievich, what do you think?
Rostelecom is the main link, the information flow, in other words, the system. Naturally, it will be targeted for various reasons, one of which, of course, is military. There are also several related reasons, reconnaissance and so on and so forth. That's why this military facility has also become a target for systematic strike. And the main thing is what we've already discussed, the so-called Rostov hub, where our targeting specialists have now identified some key points, and that's where drones have been coming in for more than a day now. I'll say it again. We would like this to continue so that at the very least electric traction is completely stopped. The Russians will have to switch to fuel-powered traction. So obviously they'll replace electric locomotives with diesel ones, for example. And here it's absolutely necessary after that to destroy the oil refineries so that these diesel locomotives have no diesel fuel, nothing to refuel with. And then it would be possible to practically stop the entire flow of Russian logistics to the Eastern Front.
As for the thermal power plants, we very rarely discuss things like this with you, but this is happening. We attacked the Novocherkassk thermal power plant.
The thing is, this is most likely a mirror strike. In the past few days, the Russians have been attacking our energy facilities, including our railways. If the mirror strike is used only in this way, it means it could be stopped in the near future. And that's a big problem. Why? Because without stopping Russian logistics, we won't win the war. The Russians will push us out. With their large numbers of personnel, equipment, and support from China and North Korea, they will simply push us out of the positions and locations that are their objectives for this summer's military campaign. That's why we need to destroy railway logistics and the energy infrastructure that powers this logistics. We need to destroy oil refineries that produce diesel, gasoline, and aviation kerosene, which fuel Russian logistics, including the Russian army. So this should be a comprehensive approach. But right now, at this moment, there isn't one. Right now, we're talking about isolated actions, but a truly comprehensive, systematic approach still isn't visible. Not a single oil refinery has been hit so far.
For more than a quarter of a day, there has been an aviation collapse in Russia. Now, a collapse on the railways is being added to this. From what I've read, just starting from last night, train traffic in Russia has been halted for hundreds of trains, both passenger and military convoys. Strike drones are attacking strategic railway hubs, and trains passing through these stations were headed to the occupied territories of Ukraine. Crowds of people have gathered, for example, at Paveletsky railway station due to train delays. According to subscribers of Russian channels, the delays are over 24 hours. Passengers waiting for their trains are simply crowding on the platforms, not understanding what's going on. Roman Grigorievich, so are we also, in a way, causing a railway collapse on Russian territory as well?
Well, aviation and railway, civilian transportation, these are naturally accompanying, so to speak, Russian problems. The main thing is that we are striking military targets. As for the fact that they simply shouldn't be moving, well, that's a question for the Russians. They shouldn't be flying. Well, we don't fly either. Our civil aviation is grounded because there are active hostilities. Naturally, Russian aviation should definitely be grounded, not necessarily across all of Russia, but at least up to the Urals, meaning the entire European part of the Russian Federation. All airfields should be grounded, and the carpet plan should remain in effect indefinitely until our victory. In other words, this is technically the correct and competent approach. But the fact that they are not implementing this plan, that is, they are not allowing for certain decisions to be made and are dragging civilians into this, into the very system of movement, including by means of aviation. But that's the Russians' problem. So naturally, they run into this issue as soon as there are serious military defeats at military facilities. Naturally, civilian facilities are shut down. Honestly, for Russians, this isn't much of a problem. They don't really need to bathe. They just scratch themselves once a week, and that's it. They'll hang out at the train station. It's no big deal.
Now, regarding the military airfield, reports say there were more than 10 explosions. An attack on the military airfield in Armavir, where attack aircraft are based. Various channels report between 10 and 20 explosions. Roman Grigorievich, what could have been attacked there? What could have been damaged?
Tactical aviation is stationed in Armavir, of course. One of the ways drones are used apart from, and primarily, of course, the best target for drones is oil refineries, that is the Russian oil industry. Any petrochemical production, processing, or transshipment facility at any level, it catches fire on its own. The second most significant and efficient target is the airfield, because an airfield has a large open field, and now most airfields, especially those more than 100 kilometers away, are being used by the Russians to the maximum. For example, they pack them with either army aviation helicopters or tactical aviation, the same Sukhois, Su-25S, Su-24S, Su-27S, Su-34S, Su-35S. The Su-30s, for instance, they pull back beyond the 300 kilometer zone, fearing our ATAC-MS strikes. We have a few ATAC-MS, but as for the smaller, especially older Soviet aircraft, they station them at airfields like Armavir and use them on the front line. For us, it's import, meaning it's possible to reach them. Drones, if there are enough of them, can basically cover a large area of any airfield. This means the destruction, first of all, not only of the aircraft themselves, but also of the aviation equipment used to service this aircraft, the destruction of airfield technical equipment and the entire airfield area. Plus, the Russians always use the airfield to deploy their radio technical troops equipment there. That is, these are mainly radars and control systems, as well as surface-to-air missiles. These can also be damaged simply by an air raid, practically just by hitting the field. So here, you don't even have to aim very precise. Even 50 kilograms of explosives packed, for example, with certain damaging elements will cause harm to all the equipment used at the airfield. Plus, the Russians also use the airfield as a transit warehouse. That is, by unloading and reloading ammunition and equipment there, these can also be targeted and damaged with drones, for example. So, in principle, that's also a good target.
Roman Grigorievich Syrski is asking Trump to bring the war to Russia. The commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Alexander Syrski, stated in an interview with the Washington Post that Ukraine needs long-range missiles in order to strike Russia without range restrictions, as was the case under the Biden administration. According to him, additional medium and long-range missiles, including American ATACMS and German Taurus systems, would allow Ukraine to slow down Russian weapons production, since Ukraine would be able to strike infrastructure that produces missiles and drones.
Well, if we're speaking in missile terminology, those are short-range missiles. The thing is, up to 500 kilometers is considered short-range. Medium range is from 500 to 5,500 kilometers. Some define medium ranges from 1,000 to 5,500 kilometers. Long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles are from 5,500 kilometers and beyond. So these are short-range missiles, which we basically already had, and we have been using them. With the same ATACMS, they use the same ATACMS to strike enemy rear positions up to 300 kilometers away. Why did they basically move their tactical aviation, but only the new ones, the Su-30s, Su-34S, Su-35 stow distances beyond 300 kilometers, for example, to Bibsk, from the Voronezh airport to Borisoglepsk, or even as far as Engels, including pulling back to Mozdok, relocated them everywhere you can imagine. They were specifically afraid of these 300-kilometer range missiles. But now, at this moment, understanding that we have few of them and Trump isn't allowing us to use them on Russian territory, there really is a ban right now. That's why Syrski is asking him at least allow what Biden had previously permitted. That is, to use them at a certain range within the operational radius of these missiles in order to sweep through Russian airfields that are within this 300-kilometer range, which are currently being used by at least Army aviation. So the request is correct and well thought out. In addition to ATACMS, Syrski is also requesting Taurus missiles, but with the Taurus, there are still issues to resolve with the Europeans regarding their supply and the mechanism for deploying them. At the moment, we don't have aircraft that could, for example, operate with the Taurus. They still need to be equipped. The same Su-24, in principle, can carry the Taurus, but the pylons need to be modified, so there's that issue. And the aircraft that could carry and launch the Taurus right away with their standard equipment, for example, the Gripens, have not yet arrived to us. There is hope that the arrival of the Gripens will coincide with the arrival of the Taurus missile. Or there's another option. If the Taurus missiles are produced here under the guise of Taras with large block assembly, then with the sledgehammer and some ingenuity, our specialists will get them working, even if they're still in the machine. I'm joking, of course, but they could.
Yes. So the key point right now is that we must continuously attack Moscow and St. Petersburg, targeting military facilities using either Ukrainian ballistic missiles, long-range drones, or our own missiles. Is that correct?
Ensuring Ukraine's security, for example, from Russia's use of long-range strike capabilities, which they have a wide range of, from drones to ballistic missiles, can only really be achieved in one way, by striking Moscow. It's 500 kilometers to Moscow. So these are exactly the kind of short-range or at the very edge, medium-range missiles that can reach there. ATACMS won't reach. They have a range of only 300 kilometers. To reach that distance, for example, if launching from HIMARS, it's only possible with PARSM missiles, which are now coming in to replace the ATACMS. It's unlikely the Americans will give us PSMs right now. Therefore, the only way to reach Moscow and protect ourselves from strikes by Russian missile systems on our territory is either Taurus missiles, which have a range of 560 kilometers. So that's possible ballistic missiles, which in principle have already been announced for several years now. We've been talking about this for so long. Well, actually, it's not us talking. What we're saying is that these are just announcements. There aren't any actual missiles yet. So as soon as missiles capable of reaching Moscow appear, That strike will put a stop to Russian strikes on Ukraine, because they'll know perfectly well that for every missile that enters Ukrainian territory, 10 missiles will hit the Kremlin. And this is what they call the so-called Achilles heel. The Russian Empire has three Achilles heels. The first is Moscow, the second is the oil refineries, and the third is Crimea. So these are the three weak spots that need to be targeted. That is, Russian facilities in Crimea need to be destroyed. There are about 150 permanent ones there. The Russian oil and gas industry needs to be destroyed, and Moscow's military sites need to be destroyed, starting with the Kremlin and ending with the Rubliovka bathhouses, the bathhouses. Well, we do have a certain fixation on those bathhouses. Most likely, the temperature there just isn't high enough.
Roman Grigorievich, regarding the FSB. So there is information that the FSB has started conducting mass inspections on tankers. The Kremlin is very afraid of a repeat of the attacks in Ust-Luga when Russian tankers exploded and there was an attack on the Russian fleet at Tenifa. Putin is panicking. Now it's not the generals. He doesn't care about who are under protection, but the oil tankers. What do you think?
Well, as we discussed before, last year we imposed those Malyuk-Budanov sanctions on them, right? They were mainly targeted at oil refineries, that is at the Russian oil industry. They can impose the same kind of sanctions on the Russian oil fleet, the so-called gray fleet, that's now transporting Russian oil all over the world. And they can do it in a fairly simple way by sabotaging these tankers, but without causing an oil spill. Why? Because any explosion of a tanker and an oil spill would create a certain catastrophe in the location where the sabotage happens or wherever the oil slick drifts. That's why it's possible to stop the movement of these tankers by carrying out targeted strikes from within on the ship's propulsion mechanisms, mainly the engines. So when you disable the engine, the tanker stays afloat, the oil doesn't go anywhere. And later it can be pumped out and returned, but it won't be transported anywhere anymore. This is the best kind of sanction from Malyuk and Budanov, the one that the FSB is now trying to protect this so-called Russian shadow fleet, the sanctioned fleet from. In addition, starting today, for several days, the Russian Navy will be conducting exercises specifically aimed at ensuring the safety of the movement of this tanker fleet, the fleet transporting sanctioned Russian oil. For several days, they will be mobilizing the Baltic fleet, the Northern fleet, and the Pacific fleet all at once. They are specifically working out these mechanisms, movement routes, and a certain sequence of actions and algorithm for escorting this cargo. In other words, they are preparing for the fact that at the very least, the sanctions imposed by the Europeans, as well as the sanctions from Malyuk and Budanov, will be applied to this fleet.
Roman Grigorievich, regarding the exercises, I really wanted to discuss this with you. It's actually the final topic, but you brought it up now. What do the large-scale exercises July Storm, which are currently taking place on Russian territory, mean? The fleet of the Terrorist Federation decided to flex its muscles from the 23rd of July to the 27th of July, 2025, conducting exercises in the waters of the Pacific and Arctic Oceans, as well as the Baltic and Caspian Seas. For some reason, the Russians are not conducting exercises in the Black Sea. The maneuvers involve up to 150 ships, 120 aircraft, 10 coastal missile systems, and more than 15,000 military personnel.
Well, there used to be a saying in the Soviet army, war is nonsense, maneuver is what matters. These are exactly the maneuvers the Russians are now conducting, precisely in places where, in principle, nothing threatens their fleet. Well, in the Baltic, the North Sea, and the Pacific Ocean, there are currently no threats. And in the Caspian, by the way, as well, the flotilla there is rather insignificant. But in reality, of course, the problems that could arise for the Black Sea Fleet, if they went out for exercises, they understand them perfectly well. And half of the remaining fleet would have been sunk. That's why they excluded the Black Sea Fleet from these exercises. But where it's safe, they conduct the exercise. But I'll repeat once again, the main objective of these exercises is escort operations. Well, first of all, you're right, it's about flexing their muscles, but for what purpose? To show that they have a fleet that will cover and protect the movement of Russian oil, since the Russian economy directly depends on it. Why are Malyuk and Budanov sanctions so important? They are very important, and moreover, they should be applied to the entire Russian hydrocarbon sector, everywhere it is found, from extraction to, of course, transshipment, processing, and finally transportation. we're waiting. It needs to be repeated as an encore because several, almost up to a dozen tankers have already been put out of commission precisely by such environmentally friendly actions, that is, by stopping the engines, mainly the engine mechanism.
Roman Grigorievich, today there were explosions in Pyatigorsk, Grozny, Bendry, the Moscow region, Moscow, Nevinomysk, and also near Yekaterinburg. That's the geography of the attacks.
Well, yes, the mass attacks that took place, they're still ongoing. That is, if we can talk, for example, about the strike on Novokuybishevsk, on that petrochemical plant, it really happened, the technological process, the cycle was stopped there. If we can say that movement, railway traffic in the area of the Rostov junctions has been halted, then all the other attacks are, for now, still at the mass attack level. It would be better if they concentrated their efforts on a single target, struck a single point. Then we could say, for example, that an airfield or some military facility had been put out of action. But as it is, what are we talking about? Just that there were explosions somewhere. Well, obviously, for Russians, even an explosion at a distance of 600 or 1,000 kilometers from the front line is at least a reason to quickly run to the bathroom at the very least. But in reality, actions like these, especially with our extremely expensive drones, have absolutely no other effect. The optimal approach is to focus on a single target, break through the frontal air defense, reach the specific target, exceed the interception rate, and deliver a combat strike to accomplish the mission against that one object. That would, of course, be the optimal scenario. The most interesting thing is that this is exactly how the Russians operate. In other words, they reach the target at a designated time from different routes, approach in a star formation, and complete the combat mission. For some reason, though, our leadership still hasn't thought of this.
There is money for Patriot systems for Ukraine, but now we need to find the Patriots themselves, said German Defense Minister Pistorius. The German Defense Ministry reported the meetings are taking place to determine which countries have Patriot systems, how many, and which are willing to transfer equipment. I don't understand. There are many Patriot systems globally. Why are we facing a shortage? There's money, but no Patriots.
To sell something you don't need, you first have to buy something you don't need, but we don't have any money. We have the opposite problem. We have money, but right now it's almost impossible to find this unneeded thing anywhere. Why? Because everyone understands perfectly well that at the moment, the main driving force in combat operations is ballistics. We've been talking about this ballistics issue with you for at least 4 years now. Why are we demanding it already? It's time to demand it from this government, which has been in power for 7 years and still hasn't produced a single ballistic missile. And those that were produced by the previous government and this one have either been ruined, sold to the Saudis, or destroyed by the program. That's why ballistics are so important. Naturally, all anti-ballistic systems are now worth their weight in gold. And it's not about the money. That's why I mentioned, in order to sell something unnecessary, you have to buy something unnecessary. It's not about the money, it's about actually having these anti-ballistic systems. As it turns out, there are very few of them lately that can actually work, for example, against ballistic missiles, especially those equipped with electronic warfare countermeasures or, say, trajectory maneuvering systems. It's very difficult to launch interceptor missiles because any anti-missile has to reach the interception point. And that point needs to be calculated. The computing requirements are quite substantial. That requires good memory. These are sophisticated systems, and as it turns out, there just aren't that many of them in the world at the moment. And the 12-day war between Israel and Iran demonstrated the effectiveness of ballistic strikes in particular. That is, the 500 Iranian ballistic missiles that hit Israel calmed Israel down since then. They haven't made any sudden moves. The same picture is seen everywhere in the world in local wars, at least in those that are predicted. It will be roughly the same. There will be the use of ballistic missiles, and of course, anti-ballistic systems will be needed. Now, every country is trying to assess this problem for itself. And naturally, right now, it's very difficult to find even a single extra anti-ballistic system. At the moment, there simply aren't any extra ones, and they can't be by definition, since practically the main striking force right now is ballistic missiles. Well, at least judging by our war and by Israel's war against Iran. This is all perfectly clear to see. So what should we do in this SI in this regard? We need to suggest to our partners, in principle, to follow the same path that Israel took. By the way, they leased the TAD system. This is a more powerful anti-ballistic system that performed the task of the Patriot. They took 8 Patriots off combat duty and practically a single TAD covered their role. Besides that, of course, they also had systems there, but that's the Aero 3, the so-called RU 3, which is also a good system, just a bit lower in altitude than the THAAD. But what we could suggest to our partners is to at least request a couple of THAAD systems from the Americans to cover Europe. And then in that case, the Europeans could share with us not just a handful, but even several dozen systems. There are more than a dozen Patriot systems in Europe which are currently being held back, I would say, to address this anti-ballistic issue. And that would solve the problem not only of short-range ballistic missiles, but also of medium-range ballistic. Putin isn't just running around with his nutcracker for no reason, like a fool with a seat. He runs around with a poop thrower in one hand and a nutcracker in the other. So with these two Ashniks, he's trying to scare Europe. And in order to provide psychological, informational, and especially technical cover, it's optimal for Europe to use exactly these American THAAD system, because the AG system, which is mainly deployed in Europe, is primarily for long-range space interception. It's mostly missile defense for America itself. These are the Mk-41 launchers, which are located on ships in the Mediterranean Sea, mainly in the Baltic. There are some parts of the sea there in the Atlantic, and also in Europe, in Romania, and in Poland as well. The Mk-41S are set up to launch SM-3 missiles, but that's not enough. These are mainly against intercontinental ballistic missiles, but against something like the Oreshnik, the optimal choice would of course be the THAAD system. It would intercept the missile before the warhead separate. That is, 200 kilometers in altitude would be enough. And we would get, I repeat once again, those same Patriots. We just need to take a creative approach and show our partners how to better solve common European security problems.
Ukraine will not receive the Patriot systems promised by Trump before the spring of 2026. That's how it is.
That's right. The thing is, those 17 Patriot launches promised by Trump, as it turns out, which is about 5 batteries with 3 launches each, plus 2 spares. Well, that's how it's been figured out now. They were supposed to come off the production line sometime in 2026 or 2027, so not before the spring. These are the Swiss Patriots that they ordered. Now they're going to transfer them to us. So, well, thanks to the Swiss for giving up their spot, so to speak, this lot. But they definitely won't arrive under these deliveries before spring. As for these Patriots, Germany could practically start transferring its 2 Patriots as soon as tomorrow, the ones that are just coming out of final assembly. But Germany needs to be sure that it will replace them with something else. And right now, Trump is not confirming that replacement. That's the problem. So Trump kind of ran his mouth as usual. He's always talking big, but honestly, he comes off more like a loudmouth, like someone just talking nonsense at the market. So this market loudmouth talked a lot, but in the end didn't actually do anything. That's precisely why we are strongly suggesting to all of our valid partners, please consider the significant benefits of either purchasing or leasing THAADs, which are essential for your operational needs. And then basically you just won't need those Patriots, just like Israel does. But we will need them because the optimal use for Patriots, based on their technical specifications, is against short-range ballistic missiles like the Russian Iskanders and Kinzhal missiles. That's the most optimal scenario. And as for protecting Europe from Oreshnik, it's definitely better to use THAADs. By the way, they can also cover us with THAADs because the interception range is quite impressive.
Roman Grigorievich, and of course, to wrap up some information that just came in over the past day, the Ukrainian Air Force has lost its first Mirage 2000. The plane crashed due to a malfunction. The pilot directed the falling aircraft to a safe area and, thank God, ejected. Thank God our pilot is alive. But this is an important point. So the Mirage 2000 crashed due to a malfunction.
Well, planes do crash because of malfunctions. The thing is, an aircraft contains thousands of different systems, literally thousands. Even though there is a special system of parallel control, so-called redundancy, the Mirage has 4 of them. At the very least, it has electric remote control, well, joystick control of the aircraft. It's an excellent aircraft. In other words, it's a 4th generation aircraft that has been produced since around 1984. So it's about 40 years old. The last planes were produced in 2007. So roughly speaking, these planes are already between 20 and 40 years old. Naturally, all the redundancy systems are in place and they perform their functions correctly. but there are some systems without which the aircraft simply cannot fly. For example, the engine's aircraft has only one, so it's a single engine machine. And if something happens to the engine, there's nothing you can do. All the redundancy systems there simply won't work. If, for example, the engine fails, or if some hydraulic system fails, there are two hydraulic control systems. That is, it's fly-by-wire, but it still controls the hydraulic system, especially for flight. And when several systems fail at once, there's nothing you can do. The only option there is either to land it, say, on its belly, on the fuselage, although that's not exactly a happy outcome either. Especially if the controls have failed or the engine has failed and you can't make it to the runway, then you have to abandon the aircraft. The plane is turned toward a safe area, somewhere with as few people as possible, and then ejection takes place. This was standard procedure, let's put it that way, standard operation for all rescue systems and decision making. So there's nothing unusual about this. These situations do happen, especially with older aircraft, and they also happen with new ones. Even new planes that have barely taken to the skies while they're still in production also have major malfunctions. These issues are later addressed after crashes or accidents. This time it was an accident. That's just for classification for our listeners to understand. In aviation, there are two terms, accident and catastrophe. If the aircraft is lost, if the pilot survives, it's an accident. If there are no injuries to personnel or civilians on the ground, it's also considered an accident. If someone dies, then it's a catastrophe. In this case, thank God it was an accident. So thank you very much.
Yes. The pilot is alive. That's the most important thing for us. Dear audience, please like this video. Write a few kind words in the comments to support Ukraine and the armed forces of Ukraine. Roman Rihorovich Tsvetan and I work together 3 times a week on my YouTube channel. The well-known military analyst Roman Tsvetan, Roman Rihorovich, thank you.
Goodbye.